All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon. Really excited to get started with y'all. We are going to dive in. So if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd just love to hear where you're coming from, what's making you happy today. A couple of things that stood out to me in terms of what's sort of trending in people's happiness. Nick in Arkansas, at Arkansas PBS, kids are about to go back to school, which is going to be a relief to some and different feelings for others. Nicole in Dallas is finally getting rain in Dallas, which I know they've been waiting for. Brian and the Dayton Contemporary Dance Company. The dancers are about to be back after a summer break. Michaela in Naples has a new job, so congratulations, Michaela. Really excited for you. Nikki's going to her spin class, which is always really exciting. One really big highlight, Michael Hicks at the Noyo Center for marine life out in Maine saw 2 gray whales this morning, which probably is more exciting than your morning or my morning. Christine out in Portland is going on her first vacation to Canada in 3 years. Gentle reminder to Christine and everyone else to make sure you take vacation, please. Do that. Jared in Roanoke, maybe one of the winners, watched all 3 Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movies this weekend with his 10-year-old, which is really exciting. I assume both for the 10-year-old and for Jared. And then Alex finally got to see one of his favorite bands called The National this weekend, which is pretty exciting. I was actually listening to The National right before this. So great band, strongly recommend. They are sort of really big a few years ago, and then also, I think, showed up on a couple of Taylor Swift songs. So The National got some more recognition that way. So check them out. I know they're on tour right now. They just rolled through Salt Lake City as well. Okay, so again, just a huge welcome. If you haven't introduced yourself, please do that. Also just wanted to say a quick hi to my friend Kathy Sheffield, who joined that webinar and has been, is I think one of the top plan giving consultants in the country, if not the world. So if you ever need help, go chat to Kathy. So we are going to chat through how to prep for end of year, which is sort of horrifying that we're already really getting to end of year planning. But as many of you know, about 40% of all giving happens in November and December. This becomes enormously powerful. And so important to get it right. And this year in particular, there are a bunch of things that are different than usual as we're entering sort of a weird time in the world and a time in the United States. So let's dive in. Some small housekeeping notes. As usual, this is good for 1.0 CFRE credits. We will drop a survey into the end of the chat. Please fill that out. That is the way we can help you. Basically what happens is once in a while, you'll get audited by CFRE to say how many things we've done, and we'll just back you up. We'll sort of go back and check our records, but so keep an eye on that and just feel free to note that in the chat pretty quickly. Or excuse me, not in the chat, in the survey. Don't do it in the chat. And today's agenda, which I won't read, but the most important thing at the bottom is to know that the recording and the slides will be sent around later today. So feel free to sit back and enjoy. You're also welcome to take notes if that's how you learn best, but we'll share this afterwards. Usually takes a few hours. Why is that? We've got to download the thing from Zoom, upload it to YouTube, process it, usually cut a little bit at the beginning and the end. And that way you can share it with your coworkers or anyone else that you feel like might have benefited if they could be here, but couldn't make it for one reason or another. Okay, so very brief introductions. My name is Patrick. Really just delighted to be here with you and delighted to be the co-founder and co-CEO of organization called FreeWill, alongside my wonderful co-founder Jenny, and we are delighted to work alongside a diverse, thoughtful, amazing team. About 220-ish people as of this week, I think. Hard to keep track, and have just crossed the $6 billion mark in terms of money raised for charity, which we're really excited about. Primarily planned gifts, but also things like stocks and crypto and qualified charitable distributions, which we're all pretty excited about. And then last thing before we get started, one thing we really like to do is just say a big thank you to folks like you that are joining. And so we're going to give away 20 of one of my favorite books. This is a book called Atomic Habits. It's a bestseller on the New York Times list. And really just thinking about how do you sort of shape a life that doesn't have to be defined by extra willpower all the time. And so how do you form good habits? How do you break bad ones? And what is all the science behind habits as opposed to just sort of like some fluffy self-help stuff? So we'll send this to 20 folks. The way to be eligible here is please make a note in the survey, and then please also include your address so we can actually send it to you. Otherwise, you've got no chance. So do that as well. By the way, as a side note, one thing I would actually love from this group at some point is book recommendations. So I'm on the Spirit of Vacation going out on Thursday night for about a week and a half, and we'll be, I'm actively hunting down book recommendations. So shoot me an email at patrick@freewill.com if you've read anything recently that you absolutely love, either fiction or nonfiction. So let me know. All right, and in that, we'll get to a little bit of how your week is going before we talk about some of the major trends happening this end of year. So first thing to note, I mean, this is really, really interesting. So we track how people are feeling week over week, and you see a massive rebound in terms of how folks are feeling. That top blue line is around happiness, yellow line is around anxiety, green line is around loneliness. And so I don't know if folks are taking more vacation or seeing the sun come out or playing outside with the kids or what it might be, but a really big shift after a couple of sort of slips downward over the past month. So that's really nice to see. Now, in contrast, we'll talk about how confident people are about hitting their goals this year. And you actually see a steady decline from the beginning of the year towards here. Now, this is not a 5-point scale, as you can see. It is 1 out of 5, but the graph only shows 3.5 to 4, so we can see some of these differences. But it is striking that some of that average is going down. So my hope is that the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be able to talk through some strategies to help pick that back up and make you feel a bit more confident about hitting your goals this year, given how important the work you have is. All right, a couple other things. We asked you about your own end of year outlook. And one of the things we asked is, do you expect this year's fundraising to be better, worse, or about the same as last year? And you can see a pretty even split. So about 50% said, look, we're probably going to be about the same. About 25% said we'll be better, and just a little bit less said we'll be about what we might be worse. So some interesting spots, and you can all see how other folks are answering here in case you're in one of these 3 categories. But what's making this year unique, right? So we could chat about end of year fundraising, and there's a world where you could give the same presentation on end of year fundraising, in 2018 and 2019, 2020, 21, 22. But there are some things, obviously the last few years have been a little bit wild, but some things that make this year in particular unique. So we'll sort of go through those, and then we'll talk about what's likely to happen in each scenario. So first thing to know is, and apologies for this component, which will be a little bit US centric, to those of you in Edmonton and BC and Montreal and Australia and South Africa who I know are joining. But we have a high profile election in the United States. So all congressional seats, everyone in the House of Representatives is up for election. 35 of 100 Senate seats, actually the highest number you can have in terms of Senate elections, and 50 gubernatorial races are all contested. This is going to be a lot of money and a lot of attention. So a lot of people asking for money and a lot of people asking for attention. We're layering this on top of looming recession and inflationary fears. A recent survey by the Federal Reserve showed that recession fears and a belief that soaring inflation will last at least through the end of the year is going to have a real impact on giving. So we'll talk about how to make the most of that. And then as an ongoing trend, we're seeing the continued shifting of demographics. Boomers are obviously aging. Millennials are really stepping into a role as major donors for really the first time. So the last year or two is the first time we see millennials showing up as major donors and not just small donors. And boomers obviously are aging, still playing a big role. We'll talk about this in a second, but also shifting the way they give, shifting the gifts available to them, shifting the role that planned giving plays. So a lot of this is happening, and this is part of a continuing trend that really started 5-10 years ago and is going to roll through the next 20 years and really change giving just based on demographics, right? Some of you have heard the old phrase, demographics are destiny, and that's true in countries, it's also true in fundraising. So let's dig into some surprising year-end trends, right? The first thing to know, dive a little bit into how the election might affect giving. So in 2012, recent presidential election, a lot of research on this. Political donations went up, this is donors who are making political donations. So it's political donors gave 1% more, non-political donors gave less. This is interesting because you might think about competition. What we really see is people tuned in or tuned out, and that's a big shift. In the final few months of every presidential election, obviously this is a midterm, political giving spikes as a percentage of total giving, and then donors who give to candidates also tend to increase overall donations to charities in 2016. So you're seeing this shift of basically your political donors are going to give more, and then your non-political donors are going to give less. It might not be what you expect, but it's sort of this sort of disengagement or engagement during political times people really tend to fall into those two camps. In 2020, overall giving went up by 5%. There are obviously a lot of factors at play here, but post-election research shows increase in contributions to organizations aligned with the losing party, right? So we talked about this a couple months back, and when we did a deeper dive in the election, but a really important thing to understand is that if you are a sort of seen as or thought of as a progressive organization in the US or a conservative organization, your fundraising success is actually inversely correlated with the success of the political party that may have similar views. And what it means is that when Democrats are successful, you will see slightly decreased giving to progressive organizations. And when Republicans are successful, you will see decreased giving towards conservative groups. You'll see a very slight decrease to non-aligned or apolitical organizations. Think about your museums and your colleges for the most part. But what you do see is, so we mentioned this earlier, increase to organizations aligned with the losing party. Now, why is this? What it tends to happen is that people like to sort of push back against something. The sort of fight back urge is sort of stronger in the human brain than the, hey, let's keep pushing in the direction that's already being successful. So post-Trump election, you saw a massive increase in donations to left-leaning groups. Post-Barack's President Obama's first election, you saw a big increase in giving towards conservative groups. You saw a lot of energy among conservative grassroots, the rise of the Tea Party, et cetera, things like that. So now what's likely to happen in 2022 in the midterms? Well, if we go and we look at 538, so gentlemen and Nate Silver, many of you will be familiar with, they've done a lot of modeling as to different potential outcomes. And so we'll sort of take the high level conclusions there and then extrapolate what that might mean for nonprofit fundraising. So the most likely outcome right now, per 538, is that Democrats hold the Senate and Republicans take the House. So you have sort of an inconclusive election in a split environment. And the likely result here is that there's relatively little giving impact across the board. You know, you don't have a resounding win in one direction or another. The second most likely outcome is that the Republicans win both the Senate and the House, right? This would happen a little bit, about 40%, also a little bit less likely than that first, right? So Republicans win the Senate, Republicans take the House. And as you might have guessed, in this, giving would increase to progressive groups and decrease to conservative groups. And so, by the way, this 40% outcomes, this is going to narrow over time. So as you continue to watch political polling, you'll see one of these become more likely or less likely. The third most likely, which might happen 2 out of 10 times in this scenario, right? So we're sort of running probabilities, or Nate and his team over at 538, is that Democrats hold both the Senate and the House, right? So that's another possibility. Would be a slight surprise, but not an impossibility. And the result would actually might be decreased giving to progressive groups and an increase to conservative groups. Now, just recall that the increase to progressive or conservative groups when the other party takes power is larger than the decrease that you might see. So you might drop a couple percentage points, or you might go up 10, 15, 20%, depending on your affiliation. And again, in political times, you're going to see a slight, relatively slight drop to what most of you would categorize yourself as, which is sort of non-political, less ideological organizations as well. So really interesting stuff here. By the way, those of you that are sort of logic focused know that there's one more possibility, which is Republicans take the Senate, Democrats take the House. Based on the sort of some structural effects in the House and gerrymandering, et cetera, that is extremely low likely. That's sort of a sub 2% likelihood. And so we haven't really chatted about that here, but just so you know, in case you're wondering there. All right, so that's political background. Well, always delighted to move off of that. Trend 2, giving is really influenced by the economy, and there are some key factors that we're looking at now. So during years of economic growth, the average increase in overall fundraising is about 5%. During economic downturns, we see slight decreases, right? So it's nice that we can hold steady in the down years and grow in the good years. Worst case scenario in recent memory is what we call the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and we did see giving drop. There's not as much evidence that that's likely to happen this year. But impacts on the stock market specifically often highly correlate with giving. So some good news and bad news here, right? During economic downturns, donors prioritize what's important to them. And in 2008, 2009, as I just mentioned, giving dropped by a total of 15%. But giving to nonprofits such as food banks, essential services actually grew by 10%. So people do really show up for what matters for them beyond finances, beyond taxes, beyond stock markets, right? And we'll talk more about this in a second, but what it really means is that when we think about potentially a more severe economic downturn, if that comes, what we want to think about is turning that into a reason for offense, right? So instead of saying, hey, even in a recession, it's still important, right? What we need to say is, because of this impact, it is now more important than ever, right? When something changes that may cut giving, you want to frame that in the now more than ever period. And we saw a lot of that happen in 2020, right? So 2020 downturn, right? Economic downturn increased giving to a lot of areas. And so really framing this as an even more important reason to give will help you be successful. We'll chat more about that later in the period. Donor demographics are shifting. So we highlighted this earlier in the conversation, but just to put some really hard numbers on it. So there are 72 million millennials in the United States right now. They recently surpassed baby boomers to be the largest American generation. General apologies, by the way, we're not talking as much about Gen X here. Really meaningful generation, a bit smaller than both. Why is that? Boomers tend to be very large and then had children who tend to be millennials, right? The silent generation, which precedes boomers, tend to be a bit smaller. Their children tend to be Gen X. And so fewer parents had fewer children, et cetera. And that's why this is so big. 23% of millennials said they want to be known for their philanthropy, not just participate in, known for their philanthropy, and that giving was an important part of their legacy. This is a really big shift. A higher percentage of millennial millionaires donate compared to non-millennial millionaires. Also really, really interesting to see. So you're seeing very strong pro-social behavior among this demographic, which is exciting. Now, quick sort of question for folks in the chat. Your best millennial prospects for major gifts will be older, right? These folks who are born in 1980 to 1989. And the question is, why, right? Why are these folks better than your younger millennials? And there's really three reasons. So we'd love to get some guesses in the chat. Also, general apologies to everyone in the Gen X world who's feeling a little bit slighted. We did do a whole session recently, by the way, on Gen X philanthropy. So go check that out, and we'll probably run it again at some point soon. Great. Wow, really interesting here. Couple of really good factors, including one that I probably haven't thought about as much, but super helpful. So a couple of things are showing up here. A lot of good guesses. There are really three things. We'll tack on a fourth. Actually, thanks to some really thoughtful feedback. So the first thing to know is, folks who are older tend to have more earning power, right? That's just how workforce tends to generally, on average, reward experience. So folks who are in this cohort make more than their younger coworkers. Not that confusing. That's one. Two is they are more likely to have appreciated assets, right? So the folks everyone starts investing at say 28. The folks who are 38 are going to have a lot more assets that have appreciated than your folks who started investing a year ago. So that's a big difference. And then the fourth is that older children tend to have older parents. And so we are seeing the beginning of a tremendous shift in wealth from boomers who are passing away to millennials. That is starting with the oldest millennials for the most part, who tend to have the older boomer parents. And so we'll dig into each of these, but it's a real cohort with three things happening at the same time. You can see some of this wealth showing up. Older millennials now make up almost as many home buyers as Gen X, and that is far beyond any other generation. And 88% of millennials currently invest some money in stocks, which is very, very high. Millennial wealth more than doubled to over $9 trillion since the pandemic began. I mean, this is really just dramatic changes. And 30% of older millennials say they have a lot of disposable income, right? Which is not as true of younger millennials. Other things we're seeing, millennials earn more money than any other generation at a similar age. They're reaching peak earning potential now, and millennial donors are growing at capacity much faster than older generations. A 10K gift from millennials, for instance, is much bigger than a 10K gift from a boomer. Not much bigger, much better. Why is that? Because they're on the upswing of their giving potential. And so someone who's giving you 10K now may be giving you 25K in 3 years and 100K in 7 years, as opposed to someone who's going to give you 10K and 10K and 10K, right? So I hope that makes sense. Aaron also notes there's more often dinks, and so we'll talk about this in a second. I mean, millennials make a lot more than their older counterparts, even adjusted for inflation. So here's an interesting graph of real median income 35 to 44. Some of you with eagle eyes will note that some of those 44 does include the youngest edge of Gen X. You can see a dip here in 2020, but if this graph continued, you'd see it go all the way back up in 2021 and 2022. So a couple of things happening here. Millennial households are more likely to have, millennial married households are more likely to have 2 incomes than previous generations. Millennials have historically been a bit more educated. So I think something like 40% of millennials have bachelor's degrees compared to 25% of boomers, 10% of balance, and Gen X, by the way, are between that 25 and 40 number. So you're really seeing these folks start to step into their own from a giving perspective, and that's pretty exciting. And then on top of this, as we mentioned earlier, over the next 30 years, it's $68 trillion, potentially more, will be passed on as the large and wealthy baby boom population and ages. And by 2030, millennials are likely to have 5 times as much wealth as they have today. So really big. This top bullet, by the way, is the reason that planned giving is so enormously important, right? At least $1 trillion, potentially $9 trillion of that is going to go into charitable giving, but a lot of it's going to go to Gen X, Gen Z, and millennial children. Boomers also had significantly fewer children, than their parents did. So inheritances are more likely to be concentrated per child, right? So my mom, for instance, was one of 7. She's a boomer. Her parents were what we call silent generation or greatest generation, I think. I have to go back and check at the exact dates. They were born in 1929. So if anyone knows what the cutoff is for silent versus greatest, that would be helpful. But she was one of 7. That was not wildly uncommon. I'm one of 4. That ends up being a huge family among my peer group, and it's very different. Oh, thanks. So silent generation, 1925 to 1945. So they would have been the oldest folks. Her parents would have been the older folks in the silent generation. All right. Other things that we're seeing, boomers are still wildly ambitious. And so there's a lot of important stuff happening here. They make up 41% of all donations. They make up 55% of all high net worth donors. So this is still the most important generation in terms of avenues. We're also seeing that this group behaves differently than older generations, meaning the silent and greatest generation. 64% prefer to give online, only 19% prefer to send a check in the mail. And so this is really shifting towards online. We'll talk about that in a second, but you have, it's really important for us to be constantly rethinking the way we think about older donors, right? So many of us sort of grew up, and when we were 9, the 75-year-olds that we knew who were our grandparents or great-grandparents were excessively non-tech savvy, right? Some of you might remember sort of explaining VCRs to your grandparents or something like that. And what you see is, other folks, boomers, sort of grew up professionally with computers, played a large role of their professional career with the internet, almost universally have smartphones. And so we need to start thinking about our older donors as much more tech savvy than what's been locked in the brains of a lot of us going forward. Other things to see. There is a really big shift in America's giving. There have been increases in overall giving for most of the last, every year for most of the last 20, 30 years, with the exception of sharp economic downturns. but giving from smaller donors has decreased, right? So the number of folks giving is going down. The total amount of money is going up. And apologies, by the way, for the sirens in the background. You can imagine I'm not in control of those. So we're seeing 2% declines in the number of small dollar donors every year since 2000. A 2018 study showed that nearly 8 out of 10 households with more than $200,000 gave. By contrast, less than 4 in 10 households with wealth less than $50,000 gave. There's a link here, by the way, to a CBS article on this study. If you want to learn more, go check it out when we send the slides. So you're really seeing this shift. So that's a really important strategy change, right? So those of you that would have been entirely dependent in the early part of the 2000s on small donors are really beginning to shift to more and more sort of fewer donors making bigger gifts. And what becomes important then is making sure those gifts are sufficiently large. So we'll talk about this in a second, but the biggest way to shift those gifts into larger categories often tends to be changing the way people give, right? Moving from cash-based to asset-based gifts is usually the #1 most successful route for taking medium and large donors and turning them into large and extra large donors. We're also seeing all of this shift happen online, right? So we're talking about not just giving moving online, but major gifts and planned gifts moving online as well. You can see, sort of near universal smartphone usage, large adoptions of tablets, people using social media in sort of huge growth. And all of this, by the way, these are pre-pandemic graphs. All of this, went way up in 2020, 21, and 22. Other things we're seeing, online giving way up, average online donations going up, which means the major gifts are moving online, right? So that's a really big shift. Thanks, Blackbot, for that research. And then when we talk about online, what we increasingly mean is online on smartphones, as opposed to just online on desktops. So donor traffic on mobile outpaces desktop for every campaign type. Nearly 1/3 of all online giving in 2021 came from mobile devices. Half of nonprofit website visits in 2021 came from mobile. More than 81% of emails are now read on cell phones, from half in 2017. So in 4 years, we went from half of emails being read on phones to 81%. And this really is shifting the way that we're giving and the way that we're writing. And then one other big trend is that all these factors come into play to increase competition for attention. So national crises, regional crises, recessions, elections. The average person, this is from Forbes and NCCS, exposed to 4,000 to 10,000 marketing messages per day, right? Nonprofits have an average of 63 email messages per subscriber per year. There are 2 million nonprofits in the United States. Obviously, some of these are very small and not quite in that 63 a year category. But suffice to say, there is a lot of competition for the attention of our donors, not just from other nonprofits, not just from news, but from the entirety of the world around us. And so thinking about how to break in here is really important. All right, so that is where we are in the world. So let's chat about what do we actually do about it. So first thing, we're going to ask for non-competitive giving types, right? So especially as we get into October and November, and then in some rare cases, you'll have runoffs that go after November. Political campaigns only take cash with some very rare exceptions. A couple of political campaigns are drifting into taking crypto, but for the most part, cash is king for federal and state elections, which means during an election year, you can focus on non-competitive giving types. Obviously, planned gifts, no campaign wants planned gifts. Qualified charitable distributions, only eligible for 501c3s. Donor advised funds, again, can only go to 501c3s. Stock gifts, there's not really the tax benefit to give to non-501c3s, and crypto, right? So all of these things, same tax treatment as stock. All of these are basically unavailable to elections, and therefore an easier route to be able to generate more gifts. As you know, but it's always worth repeating because this is the most important research that we've seen in modern fundraising. Non-cash gifts tend to be larger from the same donors. Average DAF gift, recently updated, is now about $4,500. Crypto exploding compared to 2020. Average stock gift is more than $10,000. For QCDs, these gifts tend to be $1,000 to $5,000, but up to $100,000. Really, really important. So thanks Fidelity and some of our own team at FreeWill for this research. But really seeing this across the board. You can see, we share this example sometimes. Southern Poverty Law Center nails it. This is their checkout page. And as you think about making a donation, you're availed with all these gift types before you just pick a cash number. And so this is, their amounts, 25, 50, 100, 250. These are all sort of standard on your donate pages. Every one of those gifts above, with the possible exception of PayPal, is going to be a larger gift than these. And so their job is to say, great, you want to give $100? Amazing. At least think about a stock gift, because that stock gift is going to be 70 times larger than that $100 cash gift. And by the way, it will increase your down the road gifts as well. So really great work by SPLC here. Super interesting to see an example of what works. We mentioned this, but when you can shift these folks, you'll be getting much larger gifts. The other way to think about this is when someone who could give you larger gifts who gives you cash instead, you're losing money, and that's not something we want. This is even more true with recent inflation, right? And before we get into the facts there, we'll talk more about anchor points in a second, but this is really important, especially with any of your older donors. So, there used to be this sort of trope when I was growing up where you'd sort of see this cartoon of like a really old grandfather and said something like, $1 when I was your age, we'd bring the whole family to the movie theater for $1. And it's sort of this joke about someone getting used to things being way cheaper and now not being able to sort of adjust. But that's sort of true of all of us and certainly true of your older donors. So folks that have said, oh, I'm going to give $50 a year, I'm going to give $100 a year, and have been doing that for a decade, well, suddenly at 6, 7, 8, 9% inflation, that $100 is actually worth a lot less impact than it used to be. So for folks that are anchored on a certain cash amount, their impact is actually going down year over year because salaries, programmatic costs, food, electricity, all these things that we're spending money on as part of our programming is getting more expensive. So we really want to move people away from that anchor point of cash. It just so happens that also nonprofits who accept things like appreciated securities actually grow 6 times faster than organizations taking only cash. So there is a ton of research to back this up as well. This becomes more true as we go into recession. So the inflation challenge is different than the recession challenge, although they do overlap. And I want to talk for a minute about what pickup truck marketing can teach us about fundraising during recession. So I mentioned this very briefly in a previous session, but I've sort of spent a lot more time on it here. One of the things that's happened over the last few months is that the New York Mets have been decent for what feels like the first time in my lifetime, although probably the first time in a decade. So I have been watching and listening to more baseball as I go on runs or go to the gym or do other things like that. And one of the most prominent advertisers is Dodge Ram on these broadcasts. So you hear it all the time. Thank you, Lindsay, for the affirmation. So Dodge Ram, very frequent advertiser on SNY and whatever the radio station is as well. And here's what they say, right? This is how they're framing the purchase of a new Ram truck, which is an expensive thing. I don't know exactly how much they cost, but I assume they're in the $40,000 range. This is roughly what the ads say. And I tried to find that online, so I'm paraphrasing it from memory. But in times like this, saving money is more important than ever. So hurry into your local Dodge truck dealer to get $1,000 back on the purchase of a new Ram truck, right? Let's do this again. Hurry into, saving money is super important. So hurry into your local Dodge truck dealer to get $1,000 back on the purchase of a new Ram truck. They don't say, hey, it's a great pickup truck. Come spend $40,000, right? It's framed on saving as opposed to spending, even though instead of 40, maybe you're paying 39. It's also possible these have now gotten more expensive, and I am anchored to what I thought pickup trucks costed 9 years ago. So we're going to talk more about anchor points in a second. When we start to frame gifts during a recession, we really want to talk about things that are tax smart or smarter ways to give that can help you save. And so we talk about saving as opposed to spending when we talk about these gifts. particularly with things like appreciated assets. And this really falls in the category of stock and crypto, although there's certainly things like real estate, which will also do it. These gifts help avoid capital gains taxes and typically get a full federal income tax deduction. And as I mentioned, as cash gets less valuable, we want to turn folks towards these non-cash gifts, especially these older donors with lower anchor points. As an example, QCDs tend to be another really important gift here if you have a higher percentage of 70+ donors. Now, these are pre-tax gifts out of your IRA. What we found is that organizations that marketed QCDs at least 3 times were way more likely to get a lot of gifts than those that didn't, because these are still very new to donors. And the way that we can make these work is we talk about tax saving to increase charitable interest. As a side note for these, urgency ends up being really important. For those of you, we won't get too deep into QCDs, but there's a deadline every year to make sure you take a certain amount of money out of your IRA once you turn 72. And you can send this to charity as well and preserve that sort of pre-tax money that you already have. You can see how important QCDs become end of year. Here's a rough graph of QCDs over time. These 2 giant spikes end up being end of year giving across the board. One way to frame this is in this sort of savings mindset is the money in your IRA went in pre-tax. So it'll be taxed almost any way it comes out, whether you take a distribution or even if you pass away in 30 years. That's why this is such a good way to give. Donating directly from your IRA avoids any taxes, allows you to preserve the post-tax money that you already have, right? So we talk about preserving, we talk about saving, we talk about avoiding taxes. All these things sort of feed into that mindset of saving as opposed to spending, and you'll end up with significantly larger gifts. Third thing, right? So now we've talked about the rise of millennials. And what we see, and this is, again, not to exclude Gen X, there is a lot of new money in America right now, meaning people who were not in a position to give big gifts 3 years ago, who may be here. This is as folks come into their own and earning powers, as investments, especially a lot of folks invested in sort of the dark times of 2020 and have seen significant gains in crypto, and then inheritance. So there may be more major donors in your database than you currently know. So you need to be open to surprises and not overly dependent on previous giving history, because we're seeing such stark shifts, right? This would not have been true 9 years ago when you had, sort of not quite that great wealth transfer and not as large a population coming of age into their peak earning years. So you don't want to restrict planned or major giving much, at least in some of the early times, or at least set aside some that are going to go to a much larger portion of your list than just those $25 asks, which are not going to add up to success overall on your goals. Other things to think about, thinking about some multi-channel, because what we need to do is be reminding people several times for folks that are newer to these giving types. So things like social advertising across Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. If you are a local organization, you can target by location. You can retarget your website visitors. You can use donor email addresses to create target audiences, and also audiences that look like those audiences, which can be really powerful. And this can help you reach a lot of new donors around end of year giving, especially when this repetition is necessary, right? So if you are someone who is newly wealthy, you are going to need more information about ways to give than someone who has been giving that way for 12 years because they've been wealthy for 2 decades, right? So we're starting to see this shift. And the way to take advantage of more donors really coming into their own is to make sure we're spreading that net a little bit wider than we might. Fourth strategy here, we want to embrace mobile and texting. So as we already talked about the stats on how many emails are read on mobile phones. We already talked about how many donors prefer text to calls. Even donors over 70, 94% of them text on a regular basis. And this is a really good way to break through noise, especially the inundation of email. Nearly 70% of people say they sometimes, frequently, or very frequently engage with marketing texts. So text messages can be really useful. You can particularly send these in a one-on-one context with major donors. It will really, really break through. On mobile, a couple other things, we're using fewer, stronger words. We cut out unnecessary details and language, and we keep it short, right? So 2 to 3 paragraphs, 50 to 125 words. When you are reviewing your own emails, take a look at them on your phone and not just on your really beautiful large monitor at your office desk, because that is not how most people are reading it. On text messages, you really want to use that first message to build connection, include images, include links, make it a much richer experience, and then keep it short and personal, right? This should feel more intimate than direct mail and certainly more than email. And then a couple more things before we wrap up. We really want to think about breaking through. So what are the things that really resonate with folks in a busy time? Impact emphasis, and baby boomers and Gen X, in the research we've seen, are likely to look for testimonials, either from donors like them or recipients of your work in financial reports. Millennials are likely to seek out nonprofit impact reports or news stories, and typically infographics can be better than brochures or reports, right? So something that clearly shows the impact you've had. This can be a good message to prime people with before you make an ask. We also are big fans of personalizing your message. This tends to give folks a sense of control and reduces information overload, especially in these moments where there's so much going on. 80% of consumers say they're more likely to purchase from a brand that personalizes the experience. And 58% of people say they prefer to hear from an individual at a nonprofit, talking to them as an individual, than from the nonprofit as a brand, right? And so we're not just personalizing for the recipient, we're personalizing from the sender, which is mostly going to be you at some case. And then I want to spend a little bit more time on anchor points, which I know we've briefly chatted about in the past, but is a really, really important element as we get into recessions and really echoes back to that pickup truck example. And by the way, does anyone know what this image is? When we think about anchor points, we'll put it in the chat. Jordan just says no. Thanks, Jordan. Great. Okay, so Melanie and James say, state flag of Rhode Island. Probably the best state flag, if we're being honest. Sorry to my friends in Texas and elsewhere, but Rhode Island, just an extraordinary state flag. So we'll use it for our anchor point discussion. Anchor points are really important because humans can really only think about things in contrast to something else, right? So you might see, you might see an animal and say, wow, it's a tall animal, but you're thinking compared to what, right? Taller than a dog, shorter than a giraffe, whatever it might be. And there's really 3 ways that we can anchor on amounts for fundraising. And so it's really important that when we're asking, we're thinking about how we position this. The first type of anchor is how much does this cost me? The second type of anchor is how much am I saving? And the third type of anchor is what impact am I having? So I'm going to walk through examples in a second. When we do this, we really want to stay away from the first one for donors, and we want to help the donor focus on the second and the third, or both the second and the third, right? So let's walk through this example. This is always true, right? So we should really be training our teams in how we're thinking about anchor points, but this is even more true during a potential recession. So here's an example. Can you give $10,000 this year to the land trust? What we're really anchoring on is for the donor here is $10,000. That sounds like a lot. I'm thinking, wow, that cost me a lot. Maybe I think that's 10% of my savings. Maybe I think it's, that's like a third of a new car that I was thinking about. That feels like a lot, right? It just feels like a lot of money. So that's the anchor point we don't want to be at. Another way to anchor the donor is, did you know that by giving a gift of $10,000 in appreciated stock, you might be able to save more than $5,000 in taxes this year? And suddenly we're realizing how much we're saving, and we're positioning this gift as a way to save in difficult times, as opposed to a way to part with a lot of money, right? So that's a different shift. And then the third one, right, if you're anchoring on impact, with $10,000 gift of appreciated stock, you can help us finally open the path through the preserve. This will give thousands of families a chance to experience nature in a new way next year. And we're anchoring on impact. And suddenly the $10,000 feels like a bargain for what we're achieving with that money, right? And so you can see this is the same ask in 3 different ways, and we're anchoring on different things each time. And you might imagine that the likelihood of getting to yes on number 1 is a lot lower than getting to yes on number 2 or yes on number 3. And so as we look at the asks that we're making over the course of the year, particularly at end of year, and particularly around larger gifts, we need to really focus on how are we allowing the donor to compare this in their brain, right? And so suddenly we're looking at how much we can save as opposed to how much it costs us, or we're looking at, wow, $10,000 can buy thousands of families a chance to experience nature, that feels like a great deal as opposed to what it's going to cost me. And so really, really important shifts there. A few more things before we get to some resources. A reminder that this is likely to be the highest traffic your website receives, at least on the donation side. And so rather than just send a generic thank you, which I see as one of the #1 mistakes that nonprofits make, immediately post donation or from an immediate post donation thank you, either a landing page or thank you, suggest additional ways to contribute. This ends up being an ideal time to talk about planned gifts, which are going to be about 1,000 times larger than the gift you just received, because it costs the donor nothing additional, and they're at their peak moment of generosity. A really good way to frame this is make it one of 3 suggestions. You might want to say 3 more things you can do: learn more about our work, volunteer, or make a planned gift. And this can be on the landing page after donation, or it can be in the thank you, right? These are people who are giving because they deeply care about the mission you have. They're in that mindset and they're primed to do it. And so this ends up being an enormously valuable moment. And instead it ends up being wasted real estate for some organizations. And I really see a gap emerging from sort of high-performing fundraising teams to low-performing fundraising teams based on whether they're leveraging these moments of energy for longer sustainable impact or just sort of shushing people away once they've given. And so just make sure you're taking a hard look at your own organization and which camp you're going to fall into. And the nice thing about this is that it's actually a pretty easy shift to make. You sort of do it once, you set it and forget it, and ends up being a good spot. Last thing I want to share before we get close to wrapping up is we really want to think about small asks. There's some really interesting studies that show agreeing to a small request increases the likelihood of agreeing to a second and larger request. There's a great study out of Indiana. Residents in Indiana were called and asked if hypothetically they would volunteer. And half of them said yes. 3 days later, they were called requesting help. 31% of the people who agreed to the small ask said yes. So a total of 15%, right? So you take the 31% of the 49%, 15%. Now, a separate group was not called in advance and instead was asked to volunteer. And only 4% who agreed on the spot. So what you see is more than 3.5 times difference on small asks followed by big asks, as opposed to leading with big asks. Now, 3.5 times is an enormous shift in your potential results. We can't promise exactly that, but that is just a incredibly meaningful dynamic on a larger ask. So let's look at this in practice, right? Especially in a busy moment, people's time and attention are at a premium. We talked about all the other things, right? So we've got elections, we've got recession, we've got tons of other marketing from other nonprofits. We've got tons of other marketing from every commercial enterprise on the planet, right? To say nothing of Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, family travel, school, all the other things that are going on in your life. And so a small ask can get that initial engagement, what we call a foot in the door, and move from there. Let's walk through a very practical example on one of the most important giving types. So there are gifts called qualified charitable distributions. We've talked a little bit about them. We went much deeper into these on a recent session about older donors. But if you've got a large number of folks over 70, and most of you do, right? The folks over 70 tend to be very generous, probably a big portion of your donor base. You know that if they give this way, meaning if those folks over 70 give QCDs, they will save money for themselves on taxes, and they will give you larger gifts. This is a win for you, a win for them. It's delightful. But change isn't easy because they've been giving you $100 a year forever. So we look for a small ask to make that change. We might send a video to previous donors that you know are over 70 or close to it. And here's what that looks like. Our subject line is, if you are over 70, can you please watch this 3-minute video, right? That is the entire ask. Dear Sarah, right? We're personalizing this, so we're pretending this is going to Sarah. A lot of donors over 70 are shifting the way they give in recent years. As changing tax laws means there can be some very large benefits to giving out of your IRA. Can you take just 3 minutes to watch this video we made for you about IRA giving? Just as a quick note, this video doesn't have to be great. This can be you in front of a computer talking about qualified charitable distributions for 3 minutes, right? You can make it in an hour. So that's sort of where the video comes in. And if you're not over 70, can you forward this video to someone who is? It's important that we help folks save money by getting the word out about qualified charitable distributions. So you see some of these other elements around saving and social proof that we've talked about, but we have this big ask. Can you take just 3 minutes to watch this video we made for you about IRA giving, right? That's the whole ask. It's very easy to say yes to a 3-minute video. Thank you, end of message, right? So this email goes out and that is it. Then let's call it a week later, you can email about PUCDs to people who clicked on the video, or even everybody, with a link to take action and make that gift. And our guess, based on the research that we've seen, is that you'll get a lot more people making that gift than if you just sent this first email, meaning the second email alone, right? Does that make sense? So you really open the door to people being open to committed here, et cetera. And so you want to think about similar gifts for stock gifts, endowing a scholarship, making a planned gift, et cetera. One sort of piece of language you can use is, would you be open in the future to making a gift of stock that might save you a bunch of money on taxes and make a bigger impact? And that sort of would you be open to is really interesting language, because people don't like to be not open to things. But once they've said yes, then suddenly you have this permission and they've given themselves permission to evaluate it. And so you can think about the sort of 1-2 punch or some sort of less violent metaphor to say that, but of opening the door on the bigger changes and the bigger gifts, and then coming through with an ask after that. Really interesting. Also, let us know when you try this. And so we love to hear about results. And there are a lot of creative folks on this call and generally in our community. And so we'd love to share your results going forward. All right, so that is a lot of information. I'm going to share a couple of resources before we get into questions, and we'll wrap up at 1 o'clock Eastern sharp. So a quick reminder, we are going to send a copy of this book to 20 people as a gift. My colleague June is going to drop a link in the chat now that you can use to fill out here. So please do that. Please make a note in the survey if you'd like a copy. Tell us where to send it. Thank you, June. So that link is in the Zoom chat right now. Other things that you can request in the survey, some templates to talk to donors about stock giving, and some you can use for texting. So we know texting is going to be newer to a lot of you. So we've done our best work to write sort of really strong messages that you can then put some of your own details in and get a lot out of that for donors. Hopefully that saves you time and some of the thought work and helps you be a lot more successful with some of your major donors. Very quickly, my marketing team has asked me to spend 60 seconds on FreeWill before we get back to questions about end of year. So a couple of things to brag about. Our team's been really awesome lately. And so received 100% CSAT score, which is short for customer satisfaction, almost unheard of in the industry. First time for us. So we've been working on, sanding down all the rough edges. And so we're really proud of that. Some cool feedback we got lately. Someone said, working with FreeWill is like having a part-time staff person dedicated to planned giving. Carefully worded messages around all aspects of planned and major giving. Saves us so much time. Everyone we've worked with is professional, engaging, extremely knowledgeable. Having a partner who provides expertise, messaging content, guidance on scheduling, et cetera, what they promised and exactly what they delivered. So big hats off to our partner success team. Let's see. Someone else said, FreeWill's bequest tool is so simple to use. Even better, the team at FreeWill creates the content we need to promote it, advises us on strategy. It's a plug-and-play platform, and it's had a significant impact on our small team's ability to accept gifts. I think this might be from SUNY, which raised $1 million in just 9 months, which was really exciting for them. And then they wrote that we were surprised how successful our first FreeWill campaign would be an understatement. I was shocked. We had donors who weren't on our radar with little or no engagement. We had $100,000 gift commitments, which for us is significant. So super excited. If you're interested, we would love for you to consider meeting with somebody on our team and just have a listen to what they're working on. It's generally a good fit for organizations in the US with $1 million in annual individual contributions, or about 5,000 email supporters, at least one of the two. We want to make sure that you're successful with the tools and wouldn't really take your money otherwise. So feel free to sort of have a low stakes convo with somebody from our team, and you can sign up for that in the chat. So we're a little bit low on time, so I'm going to dive right into some questions, but very quickly wanted to share a couple of things on the calendar. For FreeWill partners, and you guys should have all received calendar invites for this. So this is folks that are using the tools. We're actually kicking off our Innovation Summit tomorrow at noon Eastern. It's a 2-part summit. The second one is about a week later. but really, really excited for that. And then the next webinar is going to be on August 23rd. And we're going to really focus on Giving Tuesday and other giving days, and how do you really maximize, basically maximize giving dollars, participation on these key moments throughout the year. So we'll talk about Giving Tuesday, and we'll talk about other potential giving days throughout the year and what that looks like. If you have any creative ideas to share, or if you need anything at all, or by the way, if you have book recommendations, that's my email address. So please do that. Thanks so much. All right, we ran a little bit long, so I'm going to answer 1 or 2 questions and then just wish everybody a wonderful week. Sharon says, any way to get CFRE credit for watching the recording of one of these webinars after the live session? Yes, Sharon. So all of our webinars are live on our site, dating all the way back to March 2020. Each of them are worth 1.0 CFRE credits, and you actually manually record them yourself, meaning you sort of note that you sat through them, and then we can back you up if you get audited, but that's the way you get credit. Interesting. In terms of online giving, what shifts are you seeing for Venmo and other payment platforms? How does this vary by age? Stacy, I see a lot of success for Venmo at large events. It's sort of easy way for people to pull out their phones and make a gift to you. And so that's really interesting. In terms of online credit card forms, credit cards still seem to be a bit more effective than Venmo. And so you don't need to send somebody away. If you're already, another way to say this is, if you already have somebody on your website, credit cards tend to be fine. If you have someone at a booth or at an event and all you have is a QR code, Venmo can be a really good addition there. So that's a really interesting question. I believe there are some caps on Venmo. I think it's something like $2,500 a day. And so for your larger folks, larger donors, really want to keep them on credit cards. And then obviously, appreciated asset giving is even better than that. And we could jam in a couple more questions, but instead let's pause there at 1 o'clock Eastern and make sure folks can get to their next thing. But just want to say a huge thank you for joining, for really sort of pushing yourself to be learning more, to helping your organization. Just delighted to be able to do this with you. Always great to have a reason for us to do all this research. And we learn a ton every week. And so would love to see many of you in the Innovation Summit tomorrow and see you in a couple of weeks and talk about giving days. So just a really, really big thank you. Deeply appreciate all of you for joining. Deeply appreciate my colleague June, who did a lot of the research here. And we'd love to see you in 2 weeks. So with that, take care, and I will see you very soon.